Hey there, everyone. It's Camber here with the Yo Pro No. I'm here today with Michael Leith, Sales Strategy and Operations Associate in the Talent Solutions Department at LinkedIn out in San Francisco. He's 26, and we were connected through his college roommate, Manu Goyal, who we talked to a couple weeks back. And so I love that you guys lived together all 4 years. It must mean that you had some good synergy as roommates. And so, like I said, Michael's out in San Fran, and he's going to give us the rundown on his job and all of that today. So, Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Camber.
All right, and I love the background. It looks like I feel like we're at the bridge. So, if you want to go ahead and just start off by giving us a brief background on yourself, so where you're from, how you got to LinkedIn, and then we'll really dive into the details in later questions.
Sure. So I'm from a small town near Yosemite called Coarse Gold. Probably never heard of it. A lot of people have heard of Mariposa. So
Yes.
yeah, so weird. So I'm from around there. I went to school at Cal, UC Berkeley, class of 2017. I was an econ major, and I always kind of wanted to end up in tech, but I figured the best way to do that would be to get my foot in the door at consulting or finance first. So I did a lot of interviews at consulting companies, a lot of interviews at finance, and I ended up working my first job in finance. I ended up at Duff and Phelps, which is kind of like a big four competitor. They do valuation as well, but they do a lot of tax work.
Mhm.
So I ended up doing transfer pricing for them. And transfer pricing is basically just like how taxes work for like international transactions between different companies, especially if that companies own each other. So like if a Microsoft in Europe is acquiring or purchasing Microsoft product from Microsoft US, there's like a bunch of taxes that need to be
Okay.
worked out. So that's where I ended up my first year. And I did not really like it. I
Weird.
realized, yeah, finance and tax work just in general was not really for me. The culture, the work, the day to day. So I just started interviewing like crazy and eventually broke into tech by getting this offer at LinkedIn. And I've been here for about 2.5 years now.
Awesome.
Um, and now I'm much happier and love the team, love the company, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Well, so I have to interject here and say, so one of my first maybe dozen interviews back in 2018 was actually with somebody who was on the sales side at LinkedIn.
Mm-hmm.
And in our interview, she was like, I mean, if you're ever in New York, let me know and I'll give you a tour of the headquarters and I was planning on being in New York the next month. And I was like, well, are you serious about that? Because I'm coming. And so I ended up going to the LinkedIn headquarters, and it was, I mean, she said the same thing. She loves the culture. Obviously, I'm sure things are quite different now, but I've been a very big LinkedIn fan, and all my friends will tell you that. Mostly because
Nice.
of the platform itself. I really do love the platform, but
Yeah.
I'm really so. Anyways, I want to mention that, but I do want to hear about your day to day. So tell us about the past 2 years. What does it look like for you, and what has your experience been?
Sure. So I guess the role is basically to partner with a lot of cross-functional teams, but primarily sales. So we almost serve as like the consultants for sales. And that takes on a lot of forms. Sometimes it's like pretty monotonous stuff, like filing tickets or going on Salesforce chatters and approving cases like, oh, can this rep be added to this case? And I'll be like, yes, I approve. So there's a lot of like just custodial type stuff you got to do there. But on the other side, the other like 50 to 70% of your time, you're meeting with sales a lot, discussing forecasts. That's one of our major responsibilities, is being able to forecast sales for the quarter, for the half, whatever. We set quotas, we set territories. We have to distribute all the accounts and decide like what the segmentation is going to be. We'll partner with sales on any like strategic issues they have. So if they're like, oh, what like metrics should we be looking at to improve here, or what maybe are we missing here, or can you build a dashboard or run a model, whatever. It's like it's so all over the place. It can go anything from like data
Sounds
monkey
like
running some
it.
queries to modeling in Excel to like
Yeah.
filing tickets.
Mhm. Great. Sorry, I took a sip as you were finishing.
All
Um,
good.
and tell us a little bit more about working for a company like LinkedIn, working at a tech company like that and that size.
Sure. Yeah. So LinkedIn's pretty big now. It's been big since I joined. I definitely wasn't early. So I feel like it's starting to get to a point where it doesn't feel like a startup at all. There's a lot of different departments, a lot of red tape, a lot of times like news trickles down, but I feel like they do a really good job of like, especially during the pandemic, but even before, having like all hands where Jeff, our prior CEO, would have like big auditorium all hands, but in the San Francisco office with everyone there. Um, Actually, he was usually in the Sunnyvale office, but sometimes he'd come up and then everyone would go to that all hands.
Mm.
Um, but I think like the culture of LinkedIn has stayed intact, and that's something I've heard from other people that have been there a long time. And I think that's it's really hard to do to keep the culture intact as the company balloons from like a couple hundred to 10,000 or
Yeah.
whatever it might be, 6,000. Um, so I think LinkedIn's done a really good job of that, and a lot of that tech vibe you probably hear in other interviews from Google to Facebook. Like a lot of the basics are still there, but like what makes LinkedIn seems to also still be there.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds very similar to what I learned a couple years ago when I interviewed the other LinkedIn employee, and that's a big testament to the company. So that's really great to hear. Um, One question I always ask interviews is, what has been your biggest hardship, your biggest challenge as a young professional, and what have you done to overcome that?
Yeah, so I think it was probably getting my foot in the door at tech, coming from finance, coming as a new grad with, I think I realized I didn't want to do what I was doing probably 9 months in, so less than a year in. Um, and trying to get my foot in the door at, in like the hub of tech where it's super competitive and everyone wants to work in tech. So that was definitely a struggle. And I feel like now that I'm in tech, it's easier to kind of bounce around, but getting your foot in the door is the hard part. And I think, I mean, the number one advice I have is just persistence. Like I did so many interviews and it was often super inconvenient. I'd have to take calls from my car during lunch because like finance culture is not really like, I'm recruiting, like they don't like to hear that. So you have to kind of hide it. You can't even tell people on your team.
Right.
Whereas, I mean, tech culture is so opposite. Like I could tell my coworkers like, oh, I'm like looking to maybe go into this, and they like support you in that endeavor, which is great. But yeah, so taking calls from my car, like making up doctor's appointments to go to interviews, and I interviewed for I think a year, and it
Wow.
gets discouraging. You get a lot of no's, and then I noticed more yeses, more interest once I hit the 1 year mark at my prior job. And also, it's just like it's a muscle. I think that explaining why you want to leave so early or why you want to be at that company, like also doing the research on the company to figure out what you're going to say. It's all just skills you kind of learn as you go, and some people are really good at it naturally. I was not, so it took a little while to build that up. But I think now that I've done it, it stays with you, and I probably have to exercise a little more if I ever decide to start recruiting again. But um, I think persistence is key, and just applying to everything that sounds interesting. Like
Yeah.
even if it's just for the practice of the interview and you don't ultimately get the offer, and you can use offers to leverage other offers or to speed them along. So it's always good to get an offer even if you're not seriously considering it, and it's always good to get the practice. And you might feel a little bad if you're wasting a recruiter's time or something, but
Right.
it's
No,
kind
I
of,
mean, that's
yeah.
wonderful advice. And I mean, you mentioned persistence and just obviously getting your foot in the door. Do you feel like your peers at LinkedIn that you know of, or maybe if you have peers in other tech companies, do you feel like this is a comparable thing that they've gone through as well?
I do. Yeah. Well, so on my team, when I joined, I was one of the youngest on the team. I think I was 24, 23 when I joined.
Mhm.
And the team at that point was very tenured. I was like the youngest person on the team.
Yeah.
It was so tenured that after I joined, a lot of people started moving on just because it was like the end of that 2, 3, 4
Yeah.
year cycle. Um, but a lot of the newer people coming on were similar in the sense that like maybe they were breaking into tech from finance or consulting,
Mhm.
but most of them were much more tenured. So they
Okay.
were 2 years into their first job, or even 4 or 5 years into their first job.
Hmm.
My specific team, I don't think there's an exact analog, but like there is a lot of people that break in, and it's almost always at least in my experience, like consulting and finance
Yeah.
seem to be the big ones that
Yeah,
they
yeah. No, I mean that's
do.
very helpful. And do you still feel like that for I mean, do you feel like that for most of the jobs that you know of at LinkedIn? Or like, I mean, even like people in maybe HR or, like I'm just trying to think if anybody wanted to work, who's listening is interested in working in LinkedIn one day.
Yeah. So I think once you get a certain amount of experience, especially for HR type jobs or talent acquisition, they really like that you have like tech experience
Hmm.
because it's kind of like, I don't know, it's some weird like litmus test, but I
Hmm.
think it's still a little bit easier even if you just have experience in that field. But if you want to come into something that is um, maybe like they consider a consultant because we're basically consulting sales, if you're coming from like a completely different job with experience, like let's say you do HR now and you want to break in, that would be hard. I think that's why consulting ends up feeding in because
Yeah.
it's a natural developer of the skills that we
Yeah.
look for.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it depends on the team and the hiring manager. I know like some teams really try to diversify the people that they bring onto the team.
Mhm.
So that's not to say you could go from like HR without knowing Excel into what I'm doing. But like you could if you showed that you have the skills and you're interested in developing those skills. I
Mhm.
wouldn't rule it out.
Yeah.
I think LinkedIn's one of their like tenants. I think if you look at their culture and values, is diverse teams win, and what they mean by that is not just like ethnic backgrounds or schools, but also like where people are coming from. And it so happens we get a lot of consultants, but they interview a lot of non-consultants too, I think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I don't normally talk about this kind of level of the recruiting process. And I think that's really important because I do think it's applicable to a lot of companies, not just LinkedIn. So thank you for sharing that. And I am mindful of our time. So I want to wrap up with a few last minute questions. Talk about what it's like to be a young professional outside of the office. So obviously the past year has looked a little different. What kinds of things are you involved in? What do you like to do in your free time? Kind of tell us more about that.
Yeah, so it's hard to remember now. It's been like a year since I've had
Yeah.
a normal life. Um, so I think a lot of times it's I mean, one of the things I think we all miss the most is like spontaneous happy hours and whatnot, like after work. So that's obviously a big one. Um, I mean, a lot of times I didn't live super close to the office, so I would just kind of head home and I would play guitar or go out with friends. I lived in the marina, so
Okay.
a lot of times people go out to Fort Mason or just go bar hopping around there to different happy hours after work. Um, One thing I've been trying to get into more recently is like career development and coaching. So I think LinkedIn has some really good programs that I've been trying to get involved in.
Mhm.
Um, and there's some mentorship programs that I've reached out to get involved in as well. So that's something I'm looking to get involved in the future.
Mhm.
Um, and that's pretty much it. I think I did like there's like softball leagues or soccer leagues that I've done a few soccer things before, but nothing like recurring or major.
Right. Right. No, I mean that's again, I understand because it's like I don't really remember what I did a year ago.
Yeah, who
Um,
was I here?
yeah,
Yeah.
what did we do? But I mean, I'm glad it sounds like you can definitely pick that back up once things start to slowly ease their way back in, which it is happening in some parts of the country now. All right. And then my last question before I kind of wrap it up with you telling me any other last minute words of advice. What is a LinkedIn tip? You gotta share that with the audience because everyone always comes to me with LinkedIn questions and I can't interview a LinkedIn employee and not ask.
So do you mean like for working at LinkedIn or making a
Or
LinkedIn profile?
like a LinkedIn profile. I mean, I'm
Got it.
assuming, and you know what they say about assuming, but I'm assuming that your LinkedIn profile is like jacked up. And I looked at it earlier, it looks pretty good, but I'm sure that they
It's
don't
okay.
let their employees not have a good profile.
Yeah. So the number one tip that they tell us that is like absolutely a must is that you have to have a picture. I feel like that's not super helpful though, because most people probably have a picture that would be listening to this, but it boosts your views by like 50% or 75% or something
Mhm.
major like that, just having a picture.
Right.
I've noticed a lot of some of my friends even have their picture hidden unless you connect, but like I don't really understand why. So if you
Yeah.
have that setting, maybe don't, because like I can look at your Facebook, like
Right.
why
You
would you
want,
have one
yeah,
blocked and not the other?
especially if you just met somebody and they're like, oh, I can't remember what they look like, but if I
Yeah,
have
yeah,
this, then
exactly.
it'll help me. All right. Well, you heard it from Michael, everyone, to get a profile picture for
I
your
would also say,
LinkedIn.
yeah, if you have a good bio, I don't have a bio because I'm not like a bio kind of person.
Mhm.
But if you have a good thing you want to say about yourself, like you know what you're about, you know what you're looking for, throw it in there.
Mhm.
We have like a new open to work feature now you can check that like boosts your profile a little bit just because it like presents you to recruiters.
Mhm.
And then I think also a good tip I got when I was in college is like making your schools and like projects and stuff you're posting have a picture rather than just like that gray like paperclip like
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
an
yeah.
attachment. Like make sure it has a picture because it's a lot more engaging, and like make sure your schools all have pictures and like everything should be loaded in, not like default like
Right.
stock images or
Mhm.
blanks or
I
something.
haven't
It
heard
just
that one
looks a lot
before, but
easier.
that's great advice. Thank you. Um, well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the interview. But any last minute words of advice before we end?
uh I other than just if you're trying to get into tech, persistence is key, and always look up the company's mission and values because tech loves that stuff. We eat it
Yeah.
up in interviews, especially LinkedIn.
All right. That is a all right. Note to everyone who is considering working for a tech company, particularly LinkedIn. Make sure you know those mission and values.
And walk
Well,
the walk once you join. Don't just say it as lip service. It's
right,
important to
right.
keep
Yeah,
the
you have to live
culture
it out.
going on. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Michael. It was awesome having you on the Pro Now.
Thank you for having me. It was nice talking to you as well.